The wrist does not get enough credit. It's often referred to as a hinge joint, but really it can rotate, it can abduct and adduct, so move to the sides. It's way more complex than is led on by a hinge joint. Even when it's functioning in a relatively hinge-like fashion, so coming between flexion of about 70 to 85 degrees, an extension of about 60 to 75 degrees, it's still not a pure motion. So what actually happens if we enter extension is it doesn't happen purely backwards. Instead, the wrist actually moves, it's called radial deviation, so it comes towards the radius, the thumb side, to some extent whilst extending. And conversely, when it's flexing, it does ulnar deviation, so it moves towards the pinky. And if you visualize what that looks like, it's essentially like throwing a dart. We're coming back and towards the body, and then forward and away. Now, this dart thrower's motion is really critical to rehab. It's something that's recommended in any sort of rehabilitation for the wrist. And the rationale for this is that it's just a more natural movement. And because of that, it's going to put less strain on some of the ligaments and also result in less motion occurring in some of the bones. So the wrist is really like a set of two rows of little bones interconnected that attach to the rest of the forearm. So how wrist motion really works is we get a little bit of motion at each of those rows, but adding on the motion from each row gets us like a decent chunk of range of motion. A pretty core tenet of any idea of stability is the more mobility, generally the less stability. Or at least it's hard to stabilize in those positions. So when we do a dart thrower's motion, we get less movement at the first row, which is really where we're trying to avoid some of that movement, which means that we're getting a more stable movement. So if we're doing something like rehabilitating the wrist, we really want stability so that the wrist feels safe and we can actually strengthen things and get motor patterns back. Something that's really important to know about this movement is there's a bone in the wrist called the lunate, and during extension, what happens to the lunate is it rolls to the back side of the hand and it slides to the front, the palm side. Now that's a type of movement that I've described in a previous video. It's how essentially all the joints in the body work. They have this roll and slide action. But why that's so critical is it explains which way we want to pull in a joint mobilization. So joint mobilizations usually use a band wrapped around the wrist and then they pull in some direction to essentially facilitate the correct mechanics of the wrist. And most of them do pull backwards. I personally have experimented with some other directions, but this really gives light as to why this is the correct mechanic. We want to pull backwards towards the palm. Now those are sort of more of the involved movements of the wrist. But what if we had a relatively stable position? How do things function there? And how could they go wrong? Well, there's a bone in the wrist called the scaphoid, and it is the main force transmitter through the wrist. So it's taking a massive chunk of the compressive force and then transferring that through the rest of the wrist. So it's a very vulnerable structure. So it and the lunate are very susceptible to compression injury. And just sort of spitballing, I think that would mean that isometrics might be good for healing some sort of like injury at the scaphoid or the lunate, because it's not necessarily requiring movement, it's building up strength to withstand compression. So it's definitely something that I want to have a deeper look into. Now when we're speaking about the different positions that the wrist could be in, this is crazy for how much it influences your grip strength. So if you're in flexion, so curling your hand towards yourself, basically you're going to have a massively reduced grip strength. There's a few reasons for this. So basically the finger extensors, which are on the opposite side of the arm, are going to be really overstretched. And in that overstretched position, they're really taut, so they have like a passive tension. And that passive tension is producing some level of extension torque. And now the finger flexors, which are on the side that we're flexing towards, they're now really short, so they can't generate much force. So we get stronger when we come into neutral, but something that really surprised me is we get even stronger when we come into extension. Now that does increase grip strength, but I would assume that even though that's better for grip strength, it's not great for, say, having a barbell pressed down on your forearm, because now we're not in a neutral position to transmit that load better. And if we come back to what I was saying about compression injury, the scaphoid and the lunate are very susceptible to, it's probably not good for that. So even though higher grip strength is better, there might be scenarios where we want extension, but You know, you want to really squeeze when you're doing anything with a barbell, but I don't think it's worth sacrificing that neutral position for, just due to how the mechanics of the wrist function. For those of you who don't know, I've been learning all of this and more as a part of my 50 Days to Rebuild challenge, where I read 50 pages of a physio/exercise book and do 15 minutes of exercise in a day in an attempt to rehab myself. This is day 44, and everything I've discussed today is from Newman's Kinesiology. With the bird dog, I've been getting this hyperextension in my spine that I've been working on for some time. I tried today to activate the quads, knowing that they're hip flexors. I didn't know if it would help prevent some of that hyperextension. It seemed like it did. It was hard to activate, but again, with that activation, I'm so focused elsewhere that I'm not getting that lovely sensation I used to get through my spine before I noticed it was hyperextending. And it's possible that that lovely sensation was just extension, so it might be the wrong thing to chase. But yeah, I'm not feeling much activation in the bird dog, which is not typical of it. It's a very simple movement, but it's actually very taxing. Staying on the McGill Big Three, which the bird dog is part of, looking at the side plank. So recently I hurt my knee. I'm back to side planking without knee pain. So everything I did to sort of reduce the load on the knee seems to have helped. Looking at trying to do heel raises or calf raises, this might seem really perplexing why someone would be working on this. I actually really struggle with this movement to do it in a stable way, or to lack cracking through it. And one of the things I've focused on is trying to just stay in a neutral position. Now, I'm not sure if, much like the wrist, there actually should be some rotation occurring yet, but I do feel really weak in this position. So to me, that suggests either, like the wrist, it's actually not advantageous because you should be combining movement and that's why it's weak, or I've just been collapsing, not having good arch support. Naturally, I don't mean shoes, I despise shoes and arch support, but because I don't have that good arch support naturally in my foot, that position might be very hard to maintain, and it is feeling that way, like I'm shaking a lot. And the last thing I just want to touch on is dislocates. So this is just a big shoulder movement, as you can see in the video here. It actually felt really good for like some anterior shoulder and neck tension, which I've been feeling the last few days. And I also felt way more confident doing it because I've been reading Newman's Kinesiology. In one of the previous videos, I discussed how some of the vilified movements of the shoulder are actually necessary in certain positions. One of those is that during extension, we get anterior tilt of the scapula and downward rotation. Now, those are both vilified movements in my opinion, and they're required for this. So I feel way more confident in either driving or just allowing those actions to happen. But I will say I've still been retracting my shoulders. I think that's where it feels best. I didn't read anything about the necessity to retract, but that's what I'm feeling is working. And yeah, that is about it for day 44. I hope you enjoyed learning about the wrist. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers.